So let's give it 1 minute or two for more people join, and then we get started. Okay, so we can get started. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CMCC webinar series on localized project. We are very happy to have you all here, and we are very pleased to have our guest speaker as part of the localized project here with us, Gerard Martínez Görbig. He's gonna talk about the household vulnerability and energy consumption in vulnerable households. So we are very happy to have him here. I will just give a very short presentation about the localized project, and then I will hand it over to Gerard to start his presentation. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is about energy justice for vulnerable households. And this is part of the webinar series that we are at CMCC organizing. You will have other opportunities also to see more work from the localized project. Localized project is a Horizon 2020 project funded by European Commission. It consists of 12 partners across the EU, as you can see on the map. We are working on a project which is dedicated to localized decarbonization pathways for citizens, local administrations, and businesses to inform for mitigation and adaptation action. The objectives of the project are downscaling the national decarbonization trajectories, which are consistent with Europe's net zero target to the local levels, and provide the results to local authorities, citizens, and businesses. The project has started 3 years ago, and this year will be the last year of the project, where all the tools are developed that help the local authorities, citizens, and businesses to take benefit of the result of the project. For the webinar, you have a chance to post your questions through the option that you can see at the bottom of your page, Q&A option. Please feel free to use this and post any comment, any question that you have. And after the speaker finishes, we will go through the questions and we'll try to answer them. Now, a little bit about Gerard. So Gerard, as I mentioned, is a member of the project from University of Twente. He's a PhD student there. And as you can see, he has done his bachelor and master in Spain, and then he has moved to the Netherlands for his PhD. So with that said, I will hand it over now to Gerard to start his presentation. Happy to have you, Gerard, here. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much, Rafael, for the introduction. I will now share my screen and see if we can see the presentation.
Yes, it is coming. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So welcome, everyone. As I said, thank you, Rafael, for the introduction. I'm Gerard Martínez, and today I will speak here about the energy justice for vulnerable households, in particular on the topic of how can induced changes in these in low carbon lifestyles increase the energy poverty risk for them. I hope you read the abstract, if not just a few points as a remark. So basically the research is going to focus, or the presentation is going to focus instead of what is energy poverty, on the risk of being energy poverty, particularly related to this to a low carbon transition. And then we will focus on three different scales, which is the regional scale, and then we will focus on the lifestyles on the household and how the individual characteristics of households shape their vulnerability altogether and put them or not at increased risk of energy poverty. We are going to do it into five different points. First, we will define energy poverty to see what's the background of the issue. Then we will go into how can we measure it, because this is also important on the step that we're taking further. Later, we're going to jump into the core part of the presentation, which will be this how can low carbon transition generate energy poverty, to identify who is at risk of being energy poor, and we will finish with some conclusions, applications, and potential policy implications. So how can we define energy poverty? Actually, energy poverty is a concept that it's quite old. Let's say it was first defined actually around the 90s with this definition, which is the household expenditure exceeds the 10% of the income to achieve satisfactory indoor conditions. It's basically an economic approach, and this is because it comes from a crisis that happened in the 70s, basically in the UK, where they detected that vulnerable households affected by economic crisis and the oil shock have like real problems to deal with fuel accessibility to keep their houses warm. Not going to go into detail in the evolution, but the important thing is that the term was constantly adopted by different countries and become a crucial part of the energy field. And then these latest years, actually, it has become a really important topic, basically because it's closely related to this energy transition, and the EU is putting a lot of attention on it. Of course, this led to several new definitions, which are something like, for example, inability of households to access basic energy services and products, inability of households to keep their homes adequately warm, or when a household must reduce its energy consumption to a degree that negatively impacts the inhabitants' health and well-being. So we see here that it changed from an economic approach to really a social approach. So the definition has been somehow like concreted more, but at the same time, it become a bit more complicated to really measure it or to really evaluate it. Yeah, this is one of the official definitions that it's the latest one, actually included in the official websites, which is reducing energy consumption to a degree that negatively impacts the inhabitant health and well-being. Of course, due to these several causes that energy poverty might have, this definition, it's changing towards this multidimensional and household-centered approach. So it includes actually things that are not really actually related to energy itself, as it was before, like it includes health, well-being, etc. And then last but not least, it's important to say that it is also one of the most pressing challenges to address in the context of energy transition. How do we deal with it? So basically the EU and countries, they are providing legislative and non-legislative frameworks to understand and how to deal with it. There are also several bodies and administrations dealing with the issue. And even now, for example, it is now being included in as a mandatory pillar in the development of the sustainable energy and climate action plans that are doing for the Covenant of Mayors. However, all this has an issue that if we need to address energy poverty, we need to measure it somehow. And as we've seen, it's not that easy based on the definitions that we have. So how can we measure it? There are basically two main types of indicators or indices to measure energy poverty. So first we have these single indicators. They have more an economic approach. Like for example, this if a household is spending more than 10% of their expenses to energy, it can be considered energy poor. And then we have other indicators based on the incomes or the prices of energy, etc. Some advantages is that they are easy to calculate. However, they fail in capturing this multidimensionality of energy poverty that can be detected in the previous definitions. So we have actually multidimensional indicators that also help in measuring that. They usually include socioeconomic and demographic aspects such as income, prices, efficiency of housing, etc. And sometimes they also include households' needs and preferences. They are quite more complex to calculate, but they capture the multidimensionality of the issue. Another problem with that is that because it's something that it really needs to be targeted towards multiple dimensions of energy poverty, it's not really easy to capture all of them. So sometimes these indicators are really biased towards a specific dimension of energy poverty. So yeah, and today we are gonna basically go into this inclusion of households' needs and preferences because it is something really important when we are going into a low carbon society. Basically, these preferences and needs are kind of really similar to lifestyles, which are the distinctive patterns and manners of living of individual groups that they use to meet their biological, economic, emotional, and social needs or preferences. Then the household lifestyles differ based on what the households are actually spending in different domains, like food, housing, transport, goods, leisure, services. So the manner you are distributing your resources into these domains is also defining somehow your lifestyle. And then in Europe, particularly, there is also a strong correlation between these lifestyles, economic aspects, but also the low carbon emissions. And that is why they are so important in the end. How can we detect lifestyles? So I first want to focus on this picture that we have in the bottom right of the slide. So imagine that your lifestyle can be divided in 3 domains. So it's basically what you're spending in food, housing, or leisure. So you're spending 40% of your income in food, 40% in housing, 20% in leisure. Below we have the absolute values, but then we see that, for example, if we change our incomes, it might be that your relative percentage changes, but also the absolute values. And of course, this is something that it's not really it's not really straightforward, because you might be spending the same amount of relative expenditure in housing, or even less in food, for example, but you are spending much more in leisure. However, if we look at absolute values, it actually reflects that you're spending double your expenses now in leisure, just a bit more in housing, and exactly the same in food. This is important because this concept on how these lifestyles vary, particularly depending on the variation in incomes, this is called elasticity. And this is something that it's used to identify basic needs into the lifestyles. So let's say the less elastic, so the less increasing have a domain in relative percentage, the more basic is considered. For example, food and housing, as you can all imagine, they are basic needs. And as you can see in this graph, for example, it's amounts that they vary in absolute values, but if you look at relatives, they don't suffer an important increase of the values, of the relative values. So these basic domains provide insights of the needs of households, because the more the relative expenses households have in a basic domain, the less flexible they are to adapt to changes. And actually, these changes are really important for this low carbon transition. Energy, if we analyze, is considered a basic domain. We will go deeper into that later. And then this is actually really important to identify energy poverty, because when this happens, households can prioritize expenditures in other basic domains over energy. And then when households do not spend in energy because of these situations, this is also a form of hidden energy poverty. And there are actually some quite known examples, as for example, the heat or eat dilemma, which is when a household needs to prioritize expenditure money in food over energy. They cannot keep the house warm. They cannot comply with minimal conditions for their health and well-being, because they need to basically spend the money in other domains. And then below, I also want to make a side note. This is also a graph and a lifestyle analysis that we did taking data from the household budget expenditure from the European Commission. where they analyze the expenses of different household types in different domains. And here, in particular, instead of income, we are focusing on age ranges. So we have from 45 to 59 years old, from 30 to 44, less than 30, greater than 60. Each of these bars represent in relative percentages how much expenses are expending each group in each one of the domains. And then I want to highlight that when you, instead of income, you are looking of differentiation between other types of characteristics like age, a significant increase in this elasticity, which is not really elasticity anymore, but a significant increase on it. For example, if we look at this 35, 30, 25, and 53, this is related to health. So as you can see, when people are over 60, this significant increases. So it's also important to really look in deeper into it, because if we detect this kind of increases, it can also mean that a particular domain, it also it also can be that it's a need for a particular household, so they cannot avoid it. And I put this example here because I think that it's quite straightforward to understand that people, elderly people, might have more expenses in healthcare than other age groups. Okay, having said that, and I hope it was clear, all this lifestyle concept, we are gonna see on how this low carbon transition generate energy poverty. So there is also a wide body of literature investigating how low carbon transition can produce energy poverty. As I said, is a pressing issue in the energy transition. So there is quite some research going on in there. Doing a literature review, we also could identify several factors that are important to define this this risk of producing energy poverty. Some of them are energy accessibility, having a centralized energy system, having a low diversification. We also find some other indicators that are not really related to energy, but also considered important precisely because it's this lifestyle issue, which can be like housing security or housing affordability. And then we have a set of indicators that are actually more related to the population itself, like the income of the population, the gender, the ethnicity, housing conditions and tenure status, age, having care responsibilities. These are all stuff that can shape the vulnerability to being energy poor for households. Actually, in this particular aspect, what we identified is that each one of these indicators can be also divided in a different scale. So some of them are actually impacting a region itself. So when you are speaking about energy affordability, for example, it's about energy prices. It is something that it's impacting everyone that is living in a region in the same way. So if the energy price increases, they increase for everyone as a concept. But then we have also some other indicators that are related to the individual characteristics. So the income, the gender, ethnicity, this is related to the own characteristics of the household. So it's their individual definition. And then we also have some others that they are also related to this lifestyle thing that we changed, that we explained before, like these relations with other aspects like food or housing, but also the expenditures that they have in energy. These are actually two different things because we consider that the socioeconomic indicators, this one, they are something that so a household cannot really change itself. So there are characteristics that are kind of inherent in them, while the lifestyle is something that it can be adapted until a certain point if they have the capacity to do it. So, as I said, this is a bit of a framework to explain it a bit better. So we have this, if we need to achieve a net zero Europe and change to low carbon society, we require a low carbon transition, and this can change systems and infrastructures in a region. And these changes will actually impact the different domains. On the other hand, we have that socioeconomic characteristics. They define the citizens, and they define the income or economic capacity to deal with it. And at the same time, they also have different lifestyles that are defining this. So the three things together, let's say that if in the end there is no balance between these different domains at a household scale, then is when a household can be at risk of being energy poor due to these changes that we need to produce to switch to a low carbon society. So, having said that, now we are going to jump into who is at risk of becoming energy poor. We are going to merge a bit the the definitions that we said before with some actual data, and we will see how can we use this data about these different factors to identify these households at risk of energy poverty. So on the one hand, we have all these regional aspects. In this case, for example, we can analyze the energy systems of countries. We can analyze it based on, for example, 3 different questions, which is how decentralized are energy systems, how localized is energy production, or how much should energy systems change in a way, in the sense that, for example, if a region already is producing a lot or is not really having a lot of emissions in the terms of generation of energy, then they might be safer or not. We can hypothesize that they can be less prone to suffer from these externalities produced by changes. So in the end, we are actually analyzing how resilient are energy systems or not. This is actually something that we should also compare with other aspects. Like I put here another example. For example, what I said before about the affordability of different domains. We spoke about how the resilience of energy systems, but it's also important to analyze how are the variations in energy prices in a country. So if they tend to increase, decrease. How are these energy prices compared to the affordability of other domains? And for example, here we had some data from the rental prices for apartments in households, which we can say that in some regions specifically are quite higher than the others. So it's also important to really always compare this type of aspects all together, because they can also give insights on where can be the problems with for energy poverty detected. On the other hand, we have also these socioeconomic aspects. So actually what we found is that because in Europe, this adaptive capacity is closely related to income, we analyze the mean incomes for different household groups. We found out that for women, population outside from the EU, and population older than 60 years old, and rural population, they have generally less economic capacity to adapt. If we take a brief look in this graph here, so this shows the distribution of values that are the difference between the mean income of a group and the poverty threshold of a region. The first one represents women younger than 18. The second one, men younger than 18. The third one is the total. Then the 3 next ones are women, men, and total between 18 and 64. And the last ones are women, men, and total older than 65. So what we can actually see if we analyze the income, for example, in the older than 65, women have much more economic capacity than men as a mean in general. So the values are actually, the extreme values are actually low, but also the distribution of the all incomes, it's much more closer to the poverty threshold than it is by men, for example. Then, of course, there are also some issues that we could not really go into detail here, but there are also some groups that have less access, for example, to grant subsidies, healthcare services, or other social aids due to inherent characteristics. This is something that, for example, it's quite common to find in non-EU population in some countries. And then we also have, unfortunately, that there are some structural injustices and some cultural traditions that can also discriminate certain groups in certain regions. Of course, last but not least, it's also important to see like the share of population belonging in a particular vulnerable group, because of course if you have a lot of population that are considered vulnerable in a region, this is something also to take into account. Then I will jump into this lifestyle flexibility, which is the important part. So basically we took data from the household budget data, household budget structure data by the Eurostat, that examines this expenditure of households into different domains. And they do it for different household groups in different countries. So let's say every data point that we have is a different household group in a different European country. If we take a look at the box plot distribution. Actually, each bar represents a country, and then this is the distribution of values of their households. To be a bit more, or to have a bit more clear why are we discussing this, I put actually a line here which represents the 10% of expenditure in energy. So actually, if we, as we can see, 10 of the countries of the EU, they have values that are in theory automatically in energy poverty. If we call of these single indicators, but actually, if we also think about these dichotomies that households can not really spend money in energy because they need to spend in other issues, etc., and we expand a bit this line and we put it at 9%, so let's give a 1% of chance, we see that from 10 countries, it goes through half, actually, of the countries in the EU might have people that, according to this, might be at risk of energy poverty. I mean, it's quite a provocative statement, but it also helps to understand why it's important to focus on this lifestyle approach. Actually, it is also important because if we analyze the correlation between the energy domain and the other domains that are considered basic altogether, like housing, food, health, education, everything that we can find, we find that there is a positive correlation between them. So the more households are spending in energy, the more, always in relative expenditure, so the more percentage you are spending in energy, the more percentage you also need to spend in basic domains. While on the other hand, if we do the same but taking the non-essential domains, like for example leisure or traveling, the correlation would appear negative, in a negative relation. I want to put few examples on that. I think that they are quite to make things a bit easier to understand. So here we have the 4 different correlations of 4 different domains. So this top left, it's comparing energy relative expenditure with food relative expenditure. The bottom left, it's comparing housing relative expenditure with energy relative expenditure. And then top right, sorry, it's healthcare. And bottom right is transport. What we can find here as interesting point is that we see that the relation is a bit like it's quite obvious that it's linear. They have some patterns here. I'm not going to go into detail into it. But what we want to highlight here is that the important factor, if we want to really identify energy poor households, also in hidden forms of energy poverty, it's not important to focus on energy expenditure, but it would be more important to actually focus on the top right part of the graph. So who are these stakeholders, like these households that are really suffering from this type of dichotomies, or they are really spending a lot of their expenditures in between one domain or the other. As you can see in the transport one, there is a decreasing trend. So that would mean that it's not an essential domain, but I will go into it a bit later, and we will see why this have this pattern. Yeah, actually, what these graphs allowed us is that actually we can count the different household groups that are in Europe in general, like placed in this top right section of the graph. And then we can see that if we compare different graphs, we can see different groups that might be at risk of energy poverty because of these dichotomies between one domain or the other. For example, in food here, we can see that the older population than 60 years old, their values are commonly placed in this top right. We can see that people in the lowest income quintile are also in this top right. Population sharing an apartment, having dependent children, more than 3 adults, so it's not really a typical family structure. We can also see that they are in this top right. But then if we go into healthcare, we see that the amount of values that are placed in the top right for older than 60, it's much higher than the others, for example. We also have single adults here, which was not in the one before, and we also have also the lowest income quintiles. But then when we jump into housing, for example, what we found is that the distribution is much more closer. So it means that it's a problem that it impacts more or less like all the population all the household groups that might be impacted in a similar way. And then let's jump into transport. I did not put the counting here because what I want to highlight here is that in the transport household, unfortunately, we could not differentiate a lot between the type of transport. at a really disaggregated scale. So things like having an own car, for example, are included, and this is something that distorts a bit the data. But then if we only take the groups, for example, classified by urbanization degree, which would be degree 1 is the cities, like urban degree 2 is intermediate, degree 3 is rural. What we see here is that indeed the citizens in urban areas and intermediate areas, they have a decrease. But then if we only focus on the light blue, which is the rural one, we see that the pattern is increasing. So we see that really looking into this graph, we can see if there are any specific groups in specific conditions that might suffer from these dichotomies in specific conditions. Like this one, for example, people in rural areas, they might suffer because they actually would need the transport as a basic need for them rather than a luxury, let's say. To start finishing with this part, actually we can summarize these findings about the Slav lifestyles and socioeconomic conditions into this type of tables. We thought that it was quite interesting. So basically here what we did is placing the top 5 household groups identified for each domain. So each table corresponds only to one domain. This one is for food, this one is for housing. We place the top 5, and then in the rows, we place the different socioeconomic characteristics that are shaping the vulnerability of the individual household for their inherent characteristics or economic capacity. And then we can cross the data and see if households are also at increased risk of energy poverty besides this dichotomy for other characteristics. For example, in this case, for the food domain, if we go to older than 60 years old, we see that if they are in the lower income, it's a really higher risk for those who are in the lowest quintiles. It's even higher if they are women. It's also a really high risk if you are older than 60 for food, but you are also outside the EU. However, for example, there was not really a slightly difference in economic capacity for older than 60 years old population in terms of tenancy. So the economic capacity of owners and tenants over 60 was quite similar, in this case, according to our data in Europe in general. So there is a slightly higher risk in this case. And then some data, it was obviously not applicable because it would be like a double counting. So this is something that it did not apply in this case. And for some others, we unfortunately did not have data to compare. But these tables basically allow us to kind of having a first approximation of to identify how these groups can be at risk of energy poverty or not in a specific region. Then, of course, if we compare this with the regional data that we analyzed before, we can have like important insights on how to really deal with this potential energy poverty outcomes for a low carbon transition. So, for example, some results that we might obtain here is that, for example, countries situated in the north or northeast present better energy systems. However, the northeastern countries also have worrying values in terms of socioeconomic characteristics or flexibility in their lifestyles. On another hand, we also have that countries in southern Europe show better affordability of energy, but also present low values in socioeconomic characteristics. Or that northwestern European countries, for example, have high prices in energy, food, housing, so they might seem to have worse affordability in terms of regional aspects, but then the socioeconomic values of their inhabitants and lifestyle flexibility are positively high. So we should need to always analyze that together. Then about the socioeconomic conditions, we have that, for example, age, having care responsibilities and income are critical for identifying these groups at risk of being energy poor. They are groups that are constantly being repeated between the different domains that we analyze, so it's really important to focus into them. Then, in average, we also have that women have less economic capacity to adapt than men in any demographic categorization that we analyze. And then, of course, we said also that we mentioned briefly before that ethnicity or migration and tenure are critical factors for the age population. Based on lifestyles, we see that food and housing are showing the strongest correlation to energy. So they are mostly the most critical ones when we are trying to find for these dichotomies. And then that depending on the household group, some domains might be critical to analyze for them. So for example, if you really want to focus in a target group, you can do the process the other way around. And that Eastern and Southern European inhabitants have typically less flexibility to adapt into their lifestyles because they have typically more relative expenditure in already basic. So I will jump now into the last part. We will go to some brief conclusions, applications, policy implications, and then we will go to the Q&A section. So first of all, I want to mention that this methodology is also quite useful if we want to really analyze, we want to really suggest a just low carbon transition. Because if we want to implement measures, if we want to implement climate actions, they will always be impacting a sector. So you can talk about energy transition, but then in the end, if you are kind of want to decarbonize your food systems, then yeah, you will also need to apply changes in that aspect. And these sectors are typically related to one specific domain, which, as we said before, impacts a lifestyle. And then business balance, then it includes energy poverty for a vulnerable group. So the tables before, it shows that, for example, they are useful to analyze when you like which will be the population that will be more likely to be impacted by your changes, and then having some guidelines or having some kind of having some guidelines on how can you address these issues for this particular population in between. At the same time. Putting an example again, just to make it clear. So if we have a particular individual which have a really balanced lifestyle, but is living in a region which is highly dependent on fossil fuels, and they need to switch to a low carbon society, then of course these changes can produce externalities that can be paid by the citizens itself, so by this household. Of course, they can suffer from these dichotomies. For example, in this case, they can suffer it from the food. Like, for example, imagine that the food prices increases a lot because also some changes might increase a lot the food production costs. And then in the end, some of them may also be impacted for some due to for some like structural injustices. So if we put all together, like it's when you will have these people at risk of energy poverty. Some generic conclusions before finishing. So first of all, remarks. First of all, I want to remark that understanding how these households are at risk of energy poverty, it allows for a more identification and accurate identification of groups, and that three scales should be considered with the same importance. Of course, that the causes of energy poverty occurs at multiple scales. So this is really something that we should not really focus on the household. We should not really focus on the regional, but we need to look for it. And actually, it is really important to focus it locally as well, because each region can have their own ways of repercuting or producing externalities. Then this analyzing expenditure patterns in the basic domains at the regional scale helps monitoring the risk of energy poverty. This is something I think we made it clear. However, it always should be contextualized with energy poverty, some other energy poverty known indicators. For example, the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub did a fantastic report last year, where they compiled like to 29 energy poverty indicators, monitoring the energy poverty, so not the risk of energy, not that specific about the risk of energy poverty due to low carbon transition, but in general. And so indicators such as the inability to keep the house warm or the number of heating on degree days in a region, they can also help contextualize a lot these results that we have, especially in the regional aspect. Then that there is a close relation between household expenditures for energy and the threshold of being at risk of poverty. So this is something that we also find out in this study. It's not about energy poverty, but it's also related, like quite self-explanatory, but it was also a finding in that. Then make clear that each household type has his own way to be at risk of energy poverty. Like, for example, gender is shown to be worse than all household types. When population over 60, it becomes even more determinant, this gender, as well as being an immigrant. Yeah. And then we also have that certain household types in certain countries are more vulnerable to becoming energy poor to the lifestyle changes. And this is also quite important to contextualize the result with data of each region and each country. Then in the end, So we can also say that the analysis conducted might provide interval thresholds, might be used to identify potential at-risk of energy poverty thresholds. So let's say if we really analyze the data in detail, there might be further research done in that, but this kind of intervals can also help to systematically identify these households. And then, of course, like as a generic conclusion, we can also say that these methodologies that we presented here can also be extracted or transferred to analyze other potential changes induced by other factors. So, for example, especially in the regional aspects, we focus on the indicators that are related to energy transition. But then, for example, if we focus in how these indicators change due to climate impacts, for example, this is a methodology that can be also transferable. Yeah, and in the end, just another remark that identification of these groups as energy poverty risk should be conducted at a more local scale possible. So in this way, we can have a better overview of what's happening. Because then, of course, as we said in the beginning, there are some indicators like institutional capacity or the type of government or the access to aids or social aids that are really dependent on the context and could not be summarized in this research. So that's why it's really important to take a look into it. And that's it. So if you have now any questions, I would be pleased to answer them or debate whatever is possible. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Gerard. Very nice work and presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, if there are questions, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You can post your questions. So maybe I start off with some clarifying questions. So when you mentioned one of the dimensions that stood out as you were hinting at it was the age and over 60, especially that age group. So in terms of households, how do you define this? Because there might be a household with a mixed range of people living in the same household with the different ages. How does a household vulnerability in terms of age is defined in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So we had here two types of counting. So let's say in the terms in lifestyle. Well, let me share the screen again. I need to go back to here, actually. So in terms of lifestyles, it could not be, sorry, here. In terms of this type of analysis, that could not be possible to make, like in this type of categorizations, because the data was simply not available. However, in this type of analysis, we managed to understand the economic capacity for households who are composed by at least one member older than 60 years old. So it's not really 100% counted, but this really gives some impact. And this is something that we actually try to summarize here. When we have 3 adults sharing, we actually have one other column that it was not included here because it was the data, as I said, it was not 100%, but we could also include one column that it could be higher if they have a dependent household older than 60 years old, for example. This is also why in the conclusions we say that people people with care responsibilities in general, like not only children, have these problems. But
Yeah, it's clear. And one question about the mitigating actions, just moving a little bit forward the discussion into what should the governments or local authorities do having this kind of result. What do you think about, I'm thinking more about, for example, the energy shocks that we experienced a few years ago about as a result of the war in Ukraine. And national governments implemented different policies. So there was at least 2 very big, let's say, category. One was like subsidizing the energy providers, like the energy utility companies. And then the other proposal that some countries followed, I think even France, for example, was like giving subsidies to the households directly and subsidize their electricity bills or heating bills. So is there anything from your research that can help the decision makers in that sense to know where and how to put their, let's say, incentives and basically aid for avoiding people falling into this energy poverty?
Yeah, indeed. So first of all, one of the conclusions that we had is that if you first look at the regional characteristics of different domains of the household, you can kind of have an overview of what are the main issues for everyone. So if you have a region that you know that your energy prices are really high, then you know that you might have a problem there. So whether we need to decide where to act exactly. But even with that, so for example, if your energy prices are normal, but then your food expenditures, this is something that we found actually for some countries in the Balkan regions, they had really high food prices compared to much other domains. So you could also need to see that if even if your energy prices are low, you might have problems if you increase that, because then people will have problems to afford food, for example, because it's really high. And this is why these lifestyles are quite useful, because then if you really differentiate by households, you can really identify. So imagine that you do it by your own country with regional data. So you will be able to identify which are the groups that are really struggling the most with these dichotomies between two different domains. So you say, if I need to put subsidies in a certain aspect, then maybe I will need to help this specific group because of the type of measure that I'm implementing. The sector that will be more impacted is this one. So this is actually how we thought. Like, unfortunately, we conducted the analysis at European scale because it was the most availability of data, and it was actually more like an overview in general. But at a local scale, at a local scale or within a country scale, that could give much more interesting insights for the policymakers. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. I don't see any question online, but if our audience, anybody has a question, you can also raise your hand or request to talk. I don't know if there are any questions. Yes, Ines, I will allow you to talk, so please go ahead.
Okay, hi. Hi, Gerard. Thank you for your presentation. I remember that you said in one slide that some traditional, I don't know, rituals or cultures might also be a reason for energy poverty. Can you give examples for this? Cultural traditions, yeah, can also discriminate certain groups. What could this be? I would be interested.
Well, these ones are actually factors that came from the literature review, and were actually more like referring to aspects like, for example, intrinsic racism, for example.
What, for example? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Yeah, that this was actually coming from more like overarching like structures. Like, for example, some regions are detected to have structural racism somehow.
Okay.
It was detected, so that also, for example, worsened the energy poverty conditions with for certain groups, because they are basically not treated the same way when they have problems in general, for example.
Okay, but it's not something like a social practice, for instance, that they only eat meat, and that's why it's more expensive for them, and give more money, expend more have more expenditures for food or something like this.
No, this was more referring to the socioeconomic aspect. So, for example, to these ones, yeah, and we did not focus actually in the research into these preferences, for example, because yeah, it was really complex at an European scale. We could not find data for that, but this is another aspect that actually, if we go towards a more like focused approach on local scale, that could be also interesting to follow up in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat or any hand. So Anyway, thank you very much, Gerard. Very nice presentation. And just remind everybody that the results of this research have been published, if I'm not mistaken, Gerard, right?
They are in the deliverable of localized 6.2. It will be a public deliverable. However, it is still a bit of in revision, so it's not really public yet.
Okay.
But it will be public soon.
Soon, yeah. Okay, so visit the localized project website and check it regularly so you will see when it comes online. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation, and thank you, Gerard, for the presentation, and we'll see you in the next webinar next year. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.